This is the 38th Stiernotte lecture, which means we've been around doing this. Some of us have been around doing this for 40 years or almost 40 years. Alfred Stiernotte was the person who started philosophy at Quinnipiac, and his estate basically gave us the funds for this long-term series. The important thing about it, for me, I would say for everyone in the philosophy program and in the philosophy and political science department, is the relevance of Stiernotte lectures to the world. I won't go over all the 40, but I will say that just recently we've had a talk called Reason, Reaction, and Black Rebellion. We had a philosophical look at Black music. We had good news, fake news is old news. We've had reflections on Hannah Arendt, the right to have rights. I can just go on. These were all very exciting talks. And that has been our guiding line and light here, to say something, to hear something that makes philosophy relevant to our real life. We now have with us Wes Renfro, Senior Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Strategic Initiatives. I love the academic affairs, but strategic is also good. We're very happy to have him introduce our speaker, Professor Laurie Gruen from Wesleyan University. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Wes Renfro, and I'm the Senior Associate Dean in the College of Arts and Sciences, as Professor Beletsky has indicated. I want to let you know that Dean Roth is unable to attend today, but he is sending his sincere regrets. I'm really delighted to welcome you to our annual Stiernotte Lecture. It is a celebration of philosophy within the university, and it is a special point of pride within the College of Arts and Sciences. I want to extend many thanks to Professors Lockwood, Sacco, Beletsky, and all their colleagues in the Department of Philosophy and Political Science for making this event happen this year and every year. It's my great pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Laurie Gruen. She is the William Griffin Professor of Philosophy at Wesleyan University. She earned her PhD at the University of Colorado Boulder. In addition to teaching at Wesleyan, and this is a partial listing, she's taught at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and Stanford University. She is a leading scholar of both animal studies and feminist philosophy. She has authored over a dozen books that grapple with themes as diverse as animal ethics, the ethics of captivity, environmental philosophy, and more. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gruen.
Thank you. It's really nice to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. It may seem, especially now with what's going on in the world, all of the racial violence, the gender violence, Islamophobia, climate injustice, war, and a host of other problems, I should say wars, and a host of other problems that permeate our world, that talking about animals in the context of justice is a little bit beside the point. But I really do hope, and I definitely believe, since this is my life's work, as it were, that there are deep connections between conceptualizing non-human animals as disposable, insignificant others, and treating other human beings as disposable and insignificant. And we can learn a lot about global problems that I just listed a few of by thinking about justice and empathy beyond the human. So I want to start by, let's see if it works. Yes, it did. Asking this question, who is the subject of justice? The hope for justice, of course, is that it applies to all, regardless of difference. So if you're rich or you're poor, it's supposed to apply equally and fairly to all. If you're Black or you're white, you're supposed to be treated equally and justly. And that, it turns out, is still an ideal. It's not an actuality. And we haven't reached that ideal. But we have made some progress. If you look back at an image from the late 1800s. This is Ernst Haeckel's Pedigree of Man. You could see that some man at the very top is above other men, the ape men, and those were the non-white men. And they were on par with gorillas and chimpanzees and orangutans and gibbons, and then other animals are farther down on the tree, right? Some men, and they're men again, so some men are generally thought to be, so these are Homo sapiens, but men are thought to be lower than some of the other great apes. This idea that there is this great chain of being, or this scala natura, is not unfamiliar. This is some artistic renderings of this very idea. And what it is meant to help us think about is what I think of as moral hierarchies. And the history of these moral hierarchies are fraught with problems. Individual human beings typically have different and greater interests than other animals. And some of these kinds of other animals, say mammals and birds, maybe, are thought to have a higher status than what gets called the lower animals, maybe like squid. You see that image of a squid in the middle there, and even coral, much, much lower. And of course, humans have been insisting on their superiority to animals for millennia, not just at this turn. Some philosophers who are actually in favor of thinking seriously about animals are even suggesting that we need to reinforce this moral hierarchy so that the humans are counting for more. This is a philosopher down the street, actually, who thinks that they should count for more than we currently do. But these higher and lower ideas, that maybe some count for more and other count for less, are not really that different from the image that I showed you from the late 1800s. And we can't lose sight of the ways in which those humans at the top views don't include all humans in that instance either. And that's still the case. There are many humans that are considered lesser. They're often incarcerated humans. There are some humans that are considered subhumans still in our own country and in other parts of the world. And there are those who are sometimes referred to by animal philosophers who are interested in thinking about animals. They're referred to as quote unquote marginal cases, usually people who are thought to be cognitively disabled is the typical idea there. And this is really challenging, and I have taken it on to think about the challenge of these kind of moral hierarchies. There's one way of going to try to address these moral hierarchies, and this is a way, and this again a little bit earlier than the drawing I showed you, and this is over 100 years really before that idea. But the great chain of being is an ancient idea, so it really doesn't matter. But what Jeremy Bentham, a controversial reformer, has suggested is that we need to not think about how high you might be on some imagined moral hierarchy. So this is one way of getting around that moral hierarchy, because what we need to do, in his famous quote, is not to ask, can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? And this is an idea that got taken up more recently by another apparently Stiernotte lecturer, Peter Singer, who wanted to extend this idea, what we might call justice for animals, to all beings who can suffer. He thought, like Bentham, that to do otherwise, to think that some beings who can suffer, their suffering matters less than the like suffering of others, is a form of what he called speciesism or human exceptionalism. And these, he thinks, and many who are thinking about animals also think that this is a form of prejudice. And so the desire to convince people that this natural order isn't so natural, or that justice should prevail, led to an explosion of research. And Peter Singer wrote the book Animal Liberation in the 1970s, so it's 50 years. It's celebrating its 50th year. And part of what was happened as a result of saying, wait, let's just figure out not how to rank beings on a great chain or in a ladder or on a tree, but to actually try to figure out how like us they are so that we can expand the sphere of concerns of justice to include them. And that led to a variety of kinds of research that was done to try to see how similar they are to us. So one thing we found out, and this goes back to the glorious Jane Goodall, who's just turning 90, that animals use tools. And obviously, she showed us that chimps use tools by putting sticks into termite mounds. We've also seen birds can use tools. All sorts of animals can use tools. And so they're the same as us, but why does tool use really matter? Well, then somebody says, no, it's not really tool use that's important for being included in the sphere of sometimes called moral concern or the sphere of justice, but it's that when we're able to manipulate our environments, that's what makes us seem like we are on a par. Well, clearly we're not on a par, that we're the only animals that can manipulate our environments to destroy them. Most other animals don't do that. Then there was this idea about maybe we're similar in the ways that we solve problems, both physical problems and social problems. And there are all sorts of problems for animals to solve. Importantly, the very idea that other animals can solve problems is what has led to a recognition of their consciousness. And their consciousness is often thought to be a necessary condition for suffering. If you're aware of the fact that your life can go better or worse, then you can suffer. So importantly, suffering here is not just the ability to react to pain. Suffering also involves having an awareness that you're in a state that's a state of suffering. There's a whole bunch of things that we've also discovered, that some animals use symbols or understand and use language, that they're emotional beings, that they can respond themselves to injustice or betrayal. There's a beautiful video that I'm going to recommend that you look at if you haven't seen it, that the researcher Franz de Waal has used, which he describes as equity aversion, or a form of aversion to injustice, in which there's two capuchin monkeys side by side. Has anybody seen this video? Let me know if you have. Yes, a few of you? Okay, so this is a video of a researcher's giving, there's a capuchin monkey in one cage, a capuchin monkey in another cage, and they're divided. There's a divide between them, but they can see everything that's going on in either cage. And on the outside of the cage, there is a researcher giving, in exchange for a token, they're getting either a grape, which is a really high value item to capuchin monkeys, or a cucumber. And what you see in the video, which is hilarious, I recommend it, you could YouTube it, it's really funny, is that in exchange for giving back a token, one of the capuchin monkeys gets a grape. And in exchange, and the capuchin monkey next to this other capuchin monkey, in exchange for getting a token, gets a cucumber. Looks at the cucumber, throws the cucumber back at the researcher, and starts shaking on the cage. And it happens again and again. And then he's looking at the token. Is there something wrong with my token? You imagine he says to himself, and gets really, really angry. And this led to a view, whether it's true or not is another matter, but it led to a view that maybe animals, or at least some animals, understand injustice and respond to it. Animals are also like us in morally salient ways. They feel things, their lives can go better or worse, and they have meaningful relationships with one another. And all of this research that's been done to try to show that other animals can be in a state of mind that we could say is akin to suffering, has maybe led to some changes in the idea that animals are deserving of justice. that's not entirely clear. More recently, and this is in an article at the end of 2022, Martha Nussbaum, another important philosopher who's been thinking about animals lately, has this view. This is from the New York Times. It says, do humans owe animals equal rights? And it says Martha Nussbaum thinks so. But I took a small quote from this particular article because I think it's a really interesting upshot of the idea that if we want to extend justice to animals that suffer, we might need to figure out what is happening. And so I wanted to share this because I think it's a really confusing and problematic way of thinking about what justice beyond the human might entail. The interviewer, who's David Marchese, says, you said before that nature just isn't just, but aren't questions of justice irrelevant to things that happen in the wild beyond human control or intervention? And what Martha Nussbaum says in response, I won't read you the whole thing, you could read it, but basically she says, when people make this kind of argument, they don't understand the extent to which humans are in control in these spheres. So justice can apply in these spheres because we have control. There's no place on the planet, she says, where we don't have control. The seas are places with no human activity, but this is false. The skies, that must be a place with no human activity. She says that's false as well. This is at the end of the quote, there's no nature in the world because we're in charge everywhere. The only question is, are we going to be benign or fostering stewards or not? So the idea here is that we're in charge of everything in the world. And so insofar as we can sort of implement our ideas of justice, we should implement it in the case of animals. And I use this predation slide in particular, that image, because it seems to me that there's a very strange notion of what would happen if we're in charge of predation in the world. Is it right to watch those cheetahs get that wildebeest? Well, Martha Nussbaum thinks maybe we should intervene, that justice demands that we intervene in this instance. I'm going to leave it to you to think about all of the problems that might arise in that case. I have more problems with the very idea of thinking just about justice. I meant to introduce you to the chimpanzee in the other slide where she was working on a wrench to try to open the hydraulic system. You might think she was using tools. She was just, actually, that was Emma, and she was using the tool in a way that she just saw the guy who was fixing the hydraulic system fix it. This here is Sheba. Anybody here ever hear of Nim Chimpsky or know of the Project Nim? It's a chimp movie, a movie about a chimpanzee who was meant to be taught sign language in a brownstone in the Upper West Side. And anyway, Sheba was Nim's daughter, and Sheba is still alive at a sanctuary in Louisiana. Anyway, here are some of my worries about justice, and I'll be turning to more of a discussion of how I think we should think about our relationship with non-human animals or empathy beyond the human. But here are some of my worries. Some human capacities, as I just was identifying, will nonetheless remain at the center of any inquiry if we go along this path that the researchers like Peter Singer and Martha Nussbaum have inspired and ultimately use. So both Peter Singer and Martha Nussbaum inspired the research that I listed around language use and equity aversion and all of that, and then have picked up on that research to reinforce their views. I think it still puts the human capacities at the center, and in that sense reinforces a kind of anthropocentrism. notion that humans still are, if you will, at the top of whatever moral hierarchy, whatever image of a moral hierarchy we might have. I think it's also too abstract, too disembodied, and too generalized. We can't really think about what chimpanzees deserve. We need to think about what Sheba deserves, or what Emma deserves, or how to think about how to console Sarah or anybody else. It also assimilates to a particular set of rational or political norms. The way we understand justice is very much a human artifact of a very particular kind of conception of what it means to exact justice, one that's probably more in the tradition of liberal, with, I would say, a small L, but some people say a capital L, not liberal in the political sphere, but liberal in the sense of freedom. And liberal political theory focuses on individuals in isolation from their relationships. And that's where I want to turn our attention. I want us to start thinking about what else might it mean to include or think about non-human animals beyond this more human-centric or anthropocentric and individualized space. So I want to talk about the importance first of relationality, and then I'm going to get into a little bit of a discussion about the complexity of the relations that we're in, and then ultimately talk a little bit more about empathy and how I think empathy can both supplement and in some cases supplant our concerns for justice. So one of the reasons that I think it's so important to not be thinking about the individual capacities that might be in our heads, or might be in our bodies, or might be in our mind-body connections, but that we fundamentally think about ourselves as in relations, is that we're already in all kinds of relations. We're in all kinds of relationships. And when we start to focus on our individual capacities, we fail to recognize that those capacities only gain meaning and gain traction when they're recognized and understood by others. I would suggest, and I do suggest this in much of my writing, that relationships are what constitutes who we are. That we can't be who we are without being in relationships of various sorts. And this, I think, answers, maybe I'm being grandiose, but this, I think, can answer a really profound question in moral and political philosophy. And that is, why should we care at all? Well, one reason we should care, I suggest, is because our relationships can go bad or well. And no one would endorse, I would hope, the claim that I'm in bad relationships, and that's just fine. So when the philosopher asks the question, why care? I would suggest the answer could be, well, because your relationships are bad. And is that something that you want to take on, being in a bad relationship? So I think that this idea that we're in relationships is extraordinarily helpful for thinking about both empathy and justice under this relational perspective, because it brings those relations into focus. Making our relationships as good as we can seems like a really important overarching regulative ideal. And it's also true in our relationships that we face a variety of conflicts. We have limited time, we have limited energy, and the resources that we have access to aren't unlimited. So figuring out how to navigate the ethical and political demands of all of our different relationships provides us with really important, but also engaging challenges. And so I would suggest that we evaluate the quality and the meaning of these various relationships, exploring our dependency as well as our power and our privilege within them. And reflecting on the way in which our relationships are entangled can serve as a kind of perceptual therapy that helps us to better understand not just who we are, but also what we owe to others that we're in relation with. The goal, as I want to suggest, is not to transcend these relationships, but to understand and make them better. And in part, making these relationships better involves self-improvement too. We have to become better. We need to be more perceptive. We need to be more responsive. And then we can do better in all sorts of relations. Okay, but not all relations are good. And this is a really important thing to highlight. I'm just highlighting 4. There's hundreds of bad relationships that we're in. The anti-Blackness that exists in our country, not just now, but since its founding, raises all sorts of relational problems, social, political, personal, and conceptual, that need to be addressed. I include an orangutan on the remaining tree in a palm oil plantation that's destroyed Indonesia, and palm oil plantations are now moving to sub-Saharan Africa as well. These palm oil plantations are there in part because palm oil has become ubiquitous in pretty much everything that we consume. And so the need for more and more palm oil is sort of rising. It's the kind of thing that if you were thinking, oh, in an old way of thinking about justice, oh, there's palm oil, and I should avoid palm oil, but it's actually really difficult to avoid palm oil. Very difficult to avoid palm oil. It's in most foods that you buy at the store. It's in cleaning products. It's virtually in everything. It's destroyed the orangutan habitats. The orangutans will probably be extinct, not in my lifetime, but maybe your lifetime, students, which is a terrible thing to say. And it's because of our use of palm oil. But what this means is not that we ought to ignore the fact that we can't do anything about it. We could try to do something about it. But ultimately, what I'm getting at here is that our relationship to the orangutans is much closer than we think when we buy crackers at the store or when we buy shampoo. That we are in a relationship with the orangutans through that economic purchase and that consumption. And we can be aware of it and collectively perhaps try to make a difference. I also included a picture, which is a sad picture, but there's more and more of these lately, of a dead young whale. And in this case, garbage and pollution in the oceans led to her death. And that garbage and pollution in the oceans is killing endangered species, as well as those that are not yet endangered, in increasing and devastating numbers. So this young sperm whale, apparently this appeared in a newspaper in Scotland under the heading, "Our Shame." And they found over 200 pounds of human garbage in her gut that led to her demise. And that's garbage we made, that not like we in this room, but presumably we are involved in the production of waste that then gets put into the oceans that leads to the death of sea creatures like endangered sperm whale. And that's another bad relationship that we're in. And I also included, again, these are just a tiny sample of the number of problematic relationships that we're in. But this last one is, you might have heard recently about a scandal. Cleaning company was employing, in this country, we're employing children as young as 13 to do the dangerous and dirty cleaning in slaughterhouses. And that's an image of one. This was in 8 states. It wasn't just one small incident. This was happening all across the country. So when I say we need to focus on relationships, many people think what I mean is, oh, we're in good relationships. These are good relationships. They think it's sort of like being an ecological relation. We're all connected to one another, and this is a positive thing. What I'm suggesting is some of our relationships are really quite positive. Yes, positive, but they're also, I'm afraid, quite negative as well. And we need to attend to all of those relationships in the hopes of thinking about how we might make ourselves and those we're in relationship with both near and far better. Some relationships, like these images indicate, are relationships of care, of love, of solidarity, and of mutual aid. And I think it's in those relations that we can start to think about how to improve the other relationships that we're in. So one of the things that I think is important in thinking about a new way of thinking about relations is to think about previous work that's been done on care and love. And this is from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. What's needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and that love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love. And this is what we must see as we move on. And the inimical bell hooks saying that, importantly, love is a combination of care, of knowledge, of respect, commitment, trust, and openness. So this is an idea that I think is not a new idea, but it's an idea that isn't played up as much as it should be when we talk about justice. Importantly, justice, love, empathy, care, these are not at odds with one another, but all get strengthened when they're brought together. And in my book, Entangled Empathy, this is precisely what I try to suggest, that we're already, as I've been saying, that we're already in these relationships. We can make these relationships better, and we can do that by engaging in a process of entangled empathy. And one of the things that I want to highlight about entangled empathy is that it isn't, in much the same way that bell hooks describes it, it isn't that it's simply our feeling about the other person. It's also a process that involves cognition, thinking, awareness, understanding, intervention, and all of that. So that the idea of justice and empathy can come together. And what happens in the process of entangled empathy is that you imagine yourself in the position of the other, and then you make a judgment, which is a cognitive determination about how the conditions that the other finds herself in contribute to her state of mind or her well-being or her lack of well-being. And then you try to figure out what the best way of going might be. Now, there are a lot of skeptics about empathy. In fact, while people are calling for empathy in all sorts of areas, there's a lot of skeptics about empathy as well. And I'm just going to talk very briefly before I end about a very important criticism of empathy. Part of the worry about empathy that gets iterated again and again, another fellow down the road is one of the big empathy skeptics. And what he argues is that empathy is subject to proximity bias and sameness bias, or a bias that we empathize more with people that are like us as opposed to people or animals that aren't like us. We tend to be biased in distorting ways that aren't very useful for thinking about justice. This is his argument. And there are worries that he raises about the ways in which racial privilege, gender privilege, and species privilege provide, if we think that those privileges also bias our determination of who matters more or who counts, we're going to end up in a situation in which we're perpetuating a form of injustice rather than addressing that form of injustice. And there's a lot of studies. They basically suggest that in these studies, we see, usually studies with college students, that if there is a person of a different race or a person of a different gender, what you end up with is less empathy being directed towards them. And so that is a kind of in-group bias. There also seems to be evidence to suggest that people care more about someone who's near to them, close to them, physically, proximity bias, versus people who are farther away. My sense is that that's not actually always borne out in our experiences. And I think what we saw during the pandemic gave us a pretty clear indication of that. Mutual aid groups were popping up all over the place to try to help others in need. And it seems, and these were others of very different classes, very different races, different religious backgrounds, different neighborhoods. You often saw young people helping people who were older. And I think this was really a poignant way in which the pandemic brought out sort of the kind of empathetic justice reactions that we would hope to see. People who engaged in mutual aid, people who recognize that they had a certain kind of power or privilege vis-a-vis their mobility that they could share with those who might not be able to go out, and that sort of thing. I want to just give one other example from the animal world before we go to Q&A. And this is from sanctuaries. I think we can learn so much from sanctuaries. Sanctuaries are places where animals who are thought to be disposable are suddenly respected and admired and provided a certain amount of care and a certain amount of freedom. The top two images here are a place called Vine Sanctuary up in Vermont, where you see in the first image farther at the top, sheep and a rooster and some cows hanging out together. You also sometimes see geese with a pig or some emus or alpaca, all interacting, becoming friends, also with the human caregivers that are there. I wanted to include this example of these two cows for another set of reasons. The young cow, so the cow on your left, is named Maddox. He came to the sanctuary as an infant from a dairy in Connecticut. And one of the dirty little secrets of the dairy industry is that they have no need for the offspring. Of course, when you have a dairy industry, when you have cows in the dairy, they need to be impregnated regularly, and then they have offspring, and then they become impregnated. That's how they make milk. So there's a lot of infants, particularly male infants, that are discarded. There used to be a veal industry that was quite robust. That's kind of become less popular in our culture, because what the veal industry did was thought to be particularly cruel to the calves. So what ends up happening is these young cows or male cows are left to often starve. So they're kind of easy to rescue. If you happen to see a young cow tied to a mailbox, they're probably just going to die there. So you might want to stop and see if you can take them. In any event, this is Maddox. He came to the sanctuary when he was really small, in the back of a Subaru. So that's small, not a big cow. This is his mother 3 years later being introduced. They allowed, this particular dairy allowed her to be rescued. This is their first encounter after she came. They call her Moxie at the sanctuary. And this is their first encounter after 3 years of not seeing each other. I just think it's quite remarkable. We don't often think about cows in particular. I'll admit, I'm a little bit afraid of cows, but cows, we don't think of them as emotional, family-oriented social beings, and they're really, it was quite astonishing to see that. At the bottom, you'll see here the chimpanzees that are in the sanctuary. And one of the things that I think is really important about looking at and seeing these animals is that we get a little glimpse of the care and the empathy that they might be able to share with one another. I should add, chimpanzees are not always particularly friendly and food sharing in the way this looks like they are. They're pretty violent. But one of the things that's awesome about chimpanzees is they act out and they let it go. They forget it and it goes away. Then it might start with somebody else a few days later, but they never hold grudges. So one of the things I think is really important in thinking about empathy and justice beyond the human is that when we can learn from the other animals as well. And I think that is one of the really exciting things that's developing in work on sanctuary. So ultimately, my view is that we have theoretical commitments. And these theoretical commitments, as I started with, all that concern about the way in which we've been thinking about justice, does help us to close off other avenues that we might want to have remain open. So our commitments actually force us to either see certain things or not see certain things. And I want to suggest that we want to open our theoretical understanding so that we can see the ways that certain institutions and practices help us think of ourselves as better than or distinct from or higher up on a moral hierarchy, but rather to instead see that there are all sorts of relationships, good, bad, maybe not so pretty, but we can always learn more about ourselves and each other when we engage in and understand those relationships. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We are going to open questions, and Sean will bring you the mic if you want to ask something so that we can record it all and don't have to repeat the questions again. So the floor is open to questions. I'll leave mine till the end.
Not.
Question.
Can you hear me? Thank you so much, Lori. I think your message of relationality is really, the importance of it is really so fundamental. But I want to kind of get you to say a little bit more about the critique of empathy, because there's a philosopher that I'm sure you know by the name of Richard Rorty that has talked about how people tend to empathize kind of along the lines where you were going with people of the same group of theirs, the same kind of religion, the same. But if it's somebody that they have perceived as other, then they don't even see them as human being. And there's plenty of examples that we could. So, which is really an obstacle. We see this in conflicts now all over the world, whether in Ukraine or in the Middle East or in other. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a really important question. And I think that the idea of empathy that is being invoked in those critiques is not the same idea of empathy that I'm interested in thinking through. So empathy as kind of a raw feeling response to another, I'm sure that bias is there in those contexts, but I don't think that that's the only way to understand empathy. And entangled empathy, as I suggested, is this process. It's not a reaction. It's not an immediate feeling, but it's a process. It's a process of, sure, the feeling is the initial, it might be the initial stage in the process where you feel something for another, but then you have to engage your sort of full cognition about the situation. And I think that having people point out the prejudice is a big part of that. I think there's been studies that have been done that suggest that we turn off empathy early on. We're taught to turn, I should say, we're socialized to turn off empathy, our empathetic engagement with others. We're then taught to use it to focus on those like us or near us, close things off. But if we're thinking more ethically or in terms of how it can play a role in our ethical work, it strikes me that we need to think of it more as something that's correctable. And I think it can be correct. I think empathy can be corrected both epistemically, meaning we're basing our empathetic responses on knowledge that isn't justifiable, and we can make corrections by knowing more. And so information, knowledge, experiences, this is all going to play a role in entangled empathy. And then there's some cases in which our empathy might not be ethically warranted. And that's a harder case. But I do think that fundamentally, when we think only about ourselves and those near and dear to us, that we are, and we're engaged in a conversation about, well, you know, I love this example of thinking about whether or not one is entitled from an ethical perspective to care more about their own. And the example that's often used is that you're in a car and you're carpooling with your neighbor's children, but you're only letting your children wear all the seat belts, if that were possible. Like, imagine that you're not putting seat belts on the other kids, you're only putting the seat belts on your kids because there's not enough seat belts to go around. That's not, I don't think anybody's going to think they're really justified in doing that. And so I think that that's part of what's happening. And I think when there's the critics of empathy are suggesting that empathy is you know, there's proximity bias and there's a certain kind of similarity bias, or in-group bias is what they call it. I think we can correct for that. And I hope that answered your question.
Thanks. I loved this talk so much, and my mind is just sparking with a million ideas and questions. So thank you for coming. This is really special. And my question that what I've been wondering about this whole time is, do you extend the idea of entangled empathy to non-animal living beings? Like, can we include trees and moss in our circle of concern? How do we think about justice for those living beings?
Yeah, it's a really important question. I wish I had included that now that you said that, because I have these amazing images. There was a tree, I believe called the Kernel, a really old cypress tree, maybe 1,000 years old, really old. And the tree, there were some vandals, drug users that would get inside the tree and do drugs. And in one case, one night, they burned the tree down. The tree was burnt down. And it was a real devastation to have this beautiful old tree gone. It turns out that the town in Florida that had a sort of created a little sapling from the tree and replanted the tree and named the new tree in the same place as the Kernel. Maybe it was the governor. In any event, I'm not remembering the exact name, but I do remember the name of the tree they replanted, and that was called the Phoenix. And I'm really moved by that. And I feel like that part of the community that lost the tree and allowed the tree to come back in another form was also really moved by that. Was it empathy though? I'm not sure it was empathy. And part of the reason, and I was telling the students this earlier, some of you are here, is that you really need a perspective in order to empathize. Like, you can't, empathy requires that there be a perspective of the other that you're empathizing with. And if there is no perspective there, then it's not really empathy. It's not really entangled empathy. And one of the big criticisms of empathy that I didn't mention, but I will now, is projection, that we're just projecting our own views onto the other, what we would feel if we were in their shoes, for example, not taking into account their own histories, their own vulnerabilities, sensitivities, interests, desires, hopes, whatever. That's, if I'm just thinking about what I would feel in your position, I'm not really empathizing with you. I'm just doing something more like putting myself there. So you need the perspective that can push back and correct and help to correct. And I'm not sure that the tree had the perspective. I'm not sure that the wetlands have the perspective. I'm not sure that oceans or rivers have the perspective. Maybe they do. And if so, I'd be really interested in thinking through how we might come to understand them empathetically. But I think there are other things to be thinking about, in that empathy gets us pretty far towards that valuing that tree. The community lost that tree. The world lost the tree. This is an old tree that had, I'm going to say this in a somewhat anthropomorphic way, that had witnessed much more than, or had lived through, I should say, less anthropomorphically, lived through so much and now is randomly gone. Those are all things that we can connect with each other about. And also imagine the perspectives of the birds and the other animals that are now going to be harmed. Kind of maybe TMI here, but there was a lot in my neighborhood that was home to all these birds. And of course, with development, that lot got, bulldozed and a house got put there. And I was really saddened and upset by this. So if the developer wanted to empathize with me, they wouldn't have cut the lot down. It didn't matter if the trees were getting lost. But one of the things that happened was that I walked past before the development, but after the everything was cut down. There were all these birds just kind of like wandering around thinking, what just happened to where we hung out? So I think there's such the positive and complicated version is that we can empathize with this is my version. We can empathize with the creatures who are experiencing the loss, and we can empathize with the people who are experiencing the loss. But it's not clear to me that we can experience empathy with beings that don't have a perspective. I still think we get a lot of environmental concern but it's not, environmental ethics started in the 60s and 70s by trying to ask whether or not there's a value in nature itself outside of us. This might seem somewhat regressive to say, well, no, really, but we can empathize with all these other creatures that make that environment their home. A great question, though.
Thank you very much for your lecture. It stimulated a lot of thought, Speaking about nature, my mind is just like a huge bramble bush full of thoughts generated by you, and makes me a little frightened to even begin to address it. And I'll try not to go on too long about it. But one thing is that the idea of justice, the idea of I think that there's a difference between justice and empathy, as there is a difference between 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions, between Newton and Einstein. Justice. You talk about entangled empathy, which I love the term. Can that be taught, or is that something within us that is suppressed,
So
and that cannot be taught?
no, it has to be taught. Yeah. It's taught, and it's corrected, and it's refined, and it's honed. Yeah.
Is a child's love for its mother taught?
Say that.
Is a child's love, or is her mother taught?
Right. So let me see if I can get back. Yeah. So empathy, there's a kind of empathy and a kind of love that is in a much more, I guess, common usage, where these are things that are based in maybe reactions and emotional connections. I think that there's a variety of ways in which love and empathy might be more spontaneous. I think I know some mothers need to be taught to love their children. I think that's weirdly also true of non-human animals, where some individuals aren't very good at it and need to be taught how to do it. Sometimes in the non-human world, what happens is an aunt or a relative will take on the maternal duties because the mother isn't there to do it. But in entangled empathy, like in the case of justice, what we're doing is trying to refine, correct, and hone. We have instances of this. I'm going to give you an example that was mind-blowing to me. I'm sure many of you have these kinds of examples from your siblings or from your children, but I was visiting the chimpanzees at the sanctuary, and I was at the time bringing treats that they were used to. So I would give them gift bags because I don't go in with them. So I was giving them gift bags. And in one gift bag, I gave Sarah, chimpanzee, a kid's book, which she liked to read and then eat very quickly because it's cardboard. So why not? So she would open it and read it, pretend to read it, look at the book, look at the pictures, and then start eating it. Right. So I brought her one of those. And I brought some of the other chimpanzees things they like: toothbrushes, hairbrushes, combs, sunglasses, whatever they liked, right? But at one point, the then young chimpanzee Harper took the book away from Sarah. Now, that's not at all an unexpected thing. It was a very typical thing. And chimpanzees are quite tolerant of young juveniles doing things that they would not be tolerant of adults doing. But what happened is Sheba, who I showed you before, went over and took the book back from Harper. Okay, that's still also not a problem. They take things from each other. But she gave it back to Sarah. All of us, including people who've been working with chimpanzees for decades, were kind of, what just happened? That was very interesting. And it was a kind of thing that I think I would argue was a remnant of something that Sheba had learned, because she had been working in a quasi-human environment for a long time, doing, learning tasks, memory tasks, cognition tasks. Okay. So I think she learned that instance of justice, right? Wait, that's not your book. That's Sarah's book. I think she learned it in proximity to humans. I don't think nobody actually taught her, okay, when somebody takes a book from you. But you see this with kids, and when they reach a certain age, they will start to try to make things right. And then you teach it and you reinforce it and you encourage it. And I think the same thing with empathy. I think with entangled empathy, you start with a feeling. You start with the feeling of care, concern, empathetic engagement, love. And then you build it out, you hone it, you correct it, you make it the kind of thing that can be improved upon. So it's not at the level of the reaction. I don't know if that answers your question about whether we need to hold on to justice or not, but I think what I do hear what you're saying about justice being, important, because it's something that whether you do it or not, there's an external source of righteousness, as it were. But I think that there's ways of thinking about, and just to reiterate this, that there's a way in which justice without that care, without that love, is not the kind of justice that's the best justice.
Yeah, I agree that we're all entangled, and I believe we're entangled with the entire universe. We're all connected. Everything is connected. We're all one. Just as I'm one with my fingers and my arm. My care for my arm and my arm's care for me, not a question of justice. I don't think of justice for my arm. It's a completely different dimension than justice. I think once you have to think of justice, yes, and you often do. But once you have to think of justice, you're in trouble. And connected with that is Oh, yeah. Go. So
We could,
I'll
if there's
go
more
on to
time, we could
other
talk.
questions because
Okay, we
I
could talk
get
more.
carried away with you.
Hi, I had a question. My name is Gianna. Would you say that the likeness bias and proximity bias are there just to, I guess, just there due to the social constructs within our society, or maybe a more heightened version slash complex version of those that are prevalent within animals? I would say that we would see these even within animals or non-human animal parts. So I would just wanted to hear your thoughts on the matter.
I think what I heard, tell me if this is what I heard you saying, that other animals care more about each other than those beings that are farther away or different from that. Like, it's not that you can tell a lion or something, you really shouldn't just care about your pride. You should care also about those gazelles that you're about to eat or something. Is that where you were going with that, sort of, that other animals are not doing this, so maybe we shouldn't do this either?
Kind of. I was kind of more going off of like, we see likeness bias and proximity bias within animals, maybe just like, for example, like a pack of wolves.
Mhm.
The leader of that pack might see a straggler within the group and they might either like kick them out of the group or whatever, or they might ration more sources to that wolf if they're in danger of, I guess, falling behind or not, I guess, meeting the quota. So we see like that stuff within animals. Would you say like what we see within humans is kind of just more of a heightened version of that? And it's, I guess, almost just a part of empathy, like the bias that is present?
Yeah, so I think that you're right that we do see all sorts of bias and in-group sort of connection in animals. And we also don't, I mean, that's the example that I give you of Sheba and Sarah and Harper's little book exchange. But that was certainly influenced by, I would think, influenced by the humans that they kind of were enculturated with, as it were. They weren't raised by humans, but they were deeply enculturated in a human community. So I think what I want to say about that is that maybe we do start with that kind of bias. I think we do, but I think we can learn to move beyond it. I think that that's what all of our ethical and political education really requires, is that we recognize, right, we're animals too, and this is how animals are. But one of the things that we can do, which is really remarkable, is we can sort of change how it is that we might start out. And that is, I don't think that makes, I mean, again, I want to try to move away from those hierarchies that I started with, right? So I don't think that makes us better. It does make us different, and difference is good. Difference isn't necessarily a bad thing, but that doesn't necessarily make us better, that we're able to transcend our biases of our youth, as it were, or biases that we arise with in our communities, because we can always change. It does seem possible that maybe some animals, I always love this. So I live with some dogs who I don't think can live with cats. Maybe they could. I don't want to risk it. But I know so many people who are able, and I used to, in my youth, actually, I had a cat and had some dogs and they were fine together. But I think those are the kinds of things that there wouldn't necessarily, you could teach animals too to overcome their in-group biases by just having them live with other animals. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you.
Should I go? Hello. I was
Hi.
just wondering, you kind of touched on this briefly earlier when talking about the, you know, giving empathy to things like trees or plants. But I was wondering if you could go into a bit more where you draw that line, because you're talking about how we're not sure. There's not really emphasis, or we don't know if a wetland or a tree can, be capable of feeling these things. But at the same time, there's this idea that certain insects or other life forms, such as like an ant or something, we don't know if they can feel empathy, or even something like a sea sponge. So when it comes to giving empathy towards animals, I feel as though, to me at least, as somebody that, I'll try to take the bugs outside and everything, it seems strange to say, like, well, I'll give empathy towards animals, but then when it comes towards plants, like, is it projecting versus is it empathy? I hope I make sense with what I'm saying.
Yeah, you totally did. But I do think that ultimately the way that I'm making that distinction is based on the fact that in order to empathize, there has to be a perspective that you're taking. It's a type of empathy. One part of empathy is perspective taking. That means you take the perspective of the other. If there's no perspective, then it's not empathy as I understand it. But that doesn't mean you don't care about, like, there's a wonderful philosophical discussion about loving attention. And loving attention can be directed at all sorts of things, including, a mountain that you might climb regularly and you climb with loving attention. Or I kayak. I absolutely adore kayaking. I love the wetlands that I kayak in. And I go and I kayak in the mornings and then in the evenings over the course of the summer and watch the marsh grass change over the course of over the summer, and appreciate and love and admire that. But I'm not empathizing with it. So I want to make empathy, I want to understand empathy as a very specific kind of thing. I don't want to deny that there isn't a realm of both sort of affective and conscious and cognitive thought processes that go on with our interactions and our relationships with non-sentient natural beings. But I don't want to extend empathy so far as to make it so we can't correct it when we say it's projection. So that's part of the structure. Now, that's not to say that we might not find out after a little while that in fact there is a perspective. So one of the things that I was going to show you this little David Attenborough clip, because who doesn't love David Attenborough? But there's this really neat he's done so many programs lately, but this really neat one where they've figured out a way to really speed up plants so that you actually can see them as agential. They're actually doing things. They're like, this is not a plant. Coral are animals, but he has a new series on coral reefs, and the way in which they're active and in war and fighting for territory and doing all this, it's really remarkable, right? So it's the kind of thing that eventually it's entirely possible we'll learn that there is agency beyond what we imagine. Sponges, plants, wetlands, maybe there's agency there. And if we find that out, then there's a perspective. And if there's a perspective, then we can empathize. But at the moment, I'm suggesting, because I don't think that we have enough information about the facts of whether or not there's a perspective, we can empathize there. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question.
Isabel, thank you for this talk. Very thought-provoking, and I think the concept of relationships is a very valuable lens to look at this, or how we view animals and how we relate to them. My question was, which philosophers, or in which philosophical traditions, too, I guess, would you say have have had the most of value or interest to say on the topic of like relationships and empathy and with animals in particular?
Oh, yeah. So, so there's a different set of philosophical interlocutors that I consider to be helpful, but there's not a lot of people doing work on empathy in animals. I kind of did that because the work in the animal ethics literature is very centered on either talking about rights or talking about utility. So I talked about Peter Singer and Jeremy Bentham earlier. Martha Nussbaum's the latest in her capabilities approach and how to extend that to animals. There's a number of political philosophers who've been thinking about rights, and there's even what's called the political turn in animal ethics, and that includes philosophers like Will Kymlicka. Certainly early on, Tom Reagan was someone who thought about rights in animals. There's a number of people who are very active in that literature. But what ended up happening over the course of a while is that I realized that there was something missing from all of these discussions, and that was this question about relationality. All of these positions, the capabilities approach, the rights-based approach, the utilitarian approach, all of them overgeneralize and don't look at particularities, individual personalities. And that started me thinking, wait, we talk about chimpanzees, but chimpanzees are like, there's Sarah, or there's Harper, or there's Sheba, or there's, Flo. And so I started working on developing this view in light of that. Now, in terms of thinking about philosophers that did that, maybe not so much with animals, Iris Murdoch is a person, Edith Stein is another. I think those are really important precursors to the view, but they weren't that much in animals. And Mary Midgley may be the philosopher who she really wasn't thinking about empathy, but she was thinking differently about about animals. And the same thing is true of Cora Diamond. Cora Diamond is also somebody who didn't want to fit into the category of one of these traditional philosophical theories. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. I just had a question about empathy and kind of how it relates to human selfishness. I know that you were discussing how, humans have empathy and empathize. Well, before I begin with that, I was thinking more about because you were discussing how humans, I took some notes on this, that this relationship that we have with our environment is kind of very important for our own almost survival, sort of. And I was kind of thinking about how that could be potentially beneficial to humans. And I'm not sure if empathy is something that's more for human benefit or if it's something for our own personal benefit, like psychological benefit.
Okay, I think so. Part of what I'm trying to suggest is that so I just think about the same question that you just asked about justice. The same thing works there, right? So what I'm taking seriously is that two things, I guess I'm taking seriously at the outset. One is that we do want there to be justice. We believe in this ideal of justice. And that ideal isn't, and I'm talking about not legal justice, I'm talking about moral or political justice, right? We tend to want that, and we tend to think that is something to strive for, that's an ethical or political end that we're looking for, but we haven't really gotten there. And what would it mean to get there? It would be really challenging. We'd have to be much less selfish, wouldn't we? So that's one of the starting places. I'm thinking, right, we're already there. Now, then this is part of what I was thinking, is that if that's true, we want to get to a state in which we aren't just operating on our most immediate in self-interested desires, let's say. We want to be bigger and better, more graceful people. We want to have communities that are more flourishing, more robust, where there aren't people or animals suffering. Those kinds of, that's one of my starting points. And then the other starting point is that part of the reason that we want that is we do feel like we want, this is self-interest, where self-interest comes in. We want to be better people. We want to start our life and go through life and learn things and be better in the end. Right? So that I'm taking those things as starting points. And then this intervention is an intervention into that. Does that help answer your question? So I think that we are always struggling against our self-interest. We're always struggling against our selfishness. I think we are selfish beings. I think, I think there's maybe some beings that aren't, but I think most of us kind of are. But I think what I was thinking is that we're aiming towards something. We haven't come very close at all to that thing. I'm hoping that by embracing this idea of entangled empathy, that might help us to get closer, but maybe not.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Anybody else? Any students before oh, go ahead.
Hi, firstly, I wanted to thank you so much for this lecture. I thought that it was definitely interesting to reflect on what you brought up. I wanted to ask, if we can't empathize for plants and we utilize projection as a way to voice our concerns for them, do you think that they should hold the same importance in terms of justice or not?
Excellent question. That's a great question. So I think that, there's a long answer to this, which we don't have time for. So I'm going to try to be as quick an answer as I can. But I do think that there's a way in which we and other animals actually will suffer if we aren't attentive to the larger environment that we're in. And having said that, we can still value, if you will, the natural world, the trees, the wetland that we need. We could still value them as very important for our own flourishing and our own well-being and the flourishing and well-being of others, without recognizing them as being the subjects of entangled empathy. So I don't think I would want to say they're more or less important, because they're crucial to this, what we're talking about, this interconnected web of life. But we don't empathize with them. And that's the division that, at least for now, that's the division. I also want to say that in this, entangled empathy is not, it's a wonderful, I think, guiding ideal, but it's not an exclusive guiding ideal. So there are other ways in which we can value the more than human world. It's wondrous, it's awesome, it's beautiful, it helps us thrive. So there's all sorts of other values that are there, but it's just not that, because there's no perspective, we don't empathize. Hope that helps answer it.
Time for one more short question. What are we looking at?
You're the boss.
I'm never the boss. Okay, thank you so much, Lori. That was so challenging. And I'd like to ask a historical textual question, actually. Where did this all start? We had texts and pictures from the 17th century, 12th century, all sorts. I'm wondering, and I'm not an anthropologist or a cultural historian of culture, was the human being always considered above all the rest of the creatures? And is it universal? Don't we know today other cultures, perhaps religions, where the human being is not above all the rest? And I go immediately to the Bible, where there's that expression, the preeminence of man over the beasts. And we always use that to say something wonderful about man, but the real quote is, there is no preeminence of man over the beasts, from Ecclesiastes. But the reason given is because everything is nonsense, because everything is meaningless. That's why there's no. But if you're a philosopher or a biologist who thinks that the human being does have brains, does have a mind, does have rationality, perhaps, does know logic, you have something to hold on to by saying that man is preeminent. I don't know if that's a good word, but somewhere above all these other creatures, there's something to hang on to. So maybe we're not as wonderful with empathy. Maybe we don't know how to nurse as well, all sorts of other things, but we do have that bit of being rational, logical, or as we even mentioned about Aristotle, political, whatever it is that we are, that is somehow thought of as preeminent. So I wonder, do we know where, do we have an idea of where that could start other than religious texts?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. And I want to say two things quickly in response. One, I do think you're right. I think that there is a kind of a religious, a certain set of religious texts that does put, and it kind of goes back to, sorry, sort of this scala natura. And, you know, humans in the image of God, right? This notion, where God and angel, I mean, there's, if this is just Mark Dion's representation, but most images of the scala natura are, there's God and angels, and then there's the human, and then it goes down from there. So I think there are some religious notions that maybe have created those kinds of moral hierarchies, conceptual hierarchies. But I also want to say that importantly in philosophy now, the very nature of the very meaning of the human is being questioned. And in animal studies, it's very important because we often think of human as a biological category, but there's really important work challenging the idea that it is a biological category, that it's not a social category. And from that, we see that indeed, I mean, there was this idea that there was man, which meant white men. I mean, there's more grotesque images that you can find in this eugenicist's work, but there's all sorts of really important work in Black studies being done about the of who is human, and thinking about becoming human and how that operates. So I think one of the things that, where did it all start, is a good question. What I would want to ask is, how did a potentially religious idea sort of transcend religion and take hold popularly, so people who are atheists like Peter Singer still have this idea that man is on top, or humans are on top? Yeah, I think those are good questions.
Okay, so that leaves me, since you said I'm the manager, but John, you could do this just as well, to thank you profusely and to say that this is, hey, go ahead, sorry.
Another argument of who's better, man or woman, or is it just concretely that man's the best?
Good. No, that's exactly right. That's exactly right.
I just want to add that man was created in God's image and not woman.
And not woman. That's right.
Seeing who can go farther. But it's just like, I can't for me. Talking, I'm just talking about these bigger. I just, women would, and does it end?
Right. No, I think this is really the important thing. And we know it's not just that, I mean, Annette was talking about rationality. Well, we know that it used to be that women were thought not to have any. So humans were rational, but that meant a certain group of them. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
All right, Sean. Okay. Do we have something outside? Thank you. So you're all really invited to come to the reception outside to have something to eat and drink, and you can continue the conversation with Laurie outside.